I know you've taken a real hard look, particularly at artificial intelligence, what it means for jobs in the United States, for the workplace. What have you concluded?
Well, I'm not sure I've concluded much, David, other than to believe that it's an issue that has been underappreciated and underanalyzed in public policy terms. And I think there are three sorts of considerations here. First is the potential sheer magnitude of the impact. That is, as you noted a moment ago, may well be millions, and I've seen estimates that are not alarmist estimates that go well above a couple of million. Secondly, that those losses will not just be at the lower end of the wage scale, but could go all the way up to what we now think of as professional jobs, contributing to a further hollowing out of the middle in the American and other mature economies. Second consideration is that even if you take a fairly optimistic view of where this all may end up, that is, that technology will end up creating as many jobs as it eliminates, as has been the case in the past, the transition may be an extremely difficult one. You know, we think transition temporary, therefore it's kind of okay. But if a transition is long enough and if it's dramatic enough, there can be permanent scars to the people who lose their jobs, but I think also to the economy as a whole. You know, Bill Gates is no technophobe. He's the furthest thing from it, but he's expressed concern about the pace of the change. And the third consideration, I think, is the intersection of the economics and the politics. You know, since if you go back to the enclosure movement and the early industrial revolution in Britain, when there is substantial displacement that has a social as well as an economic effect, there is a high correlation with political consequences, including more polarization, more disaffection, more movement away from the center towards more dramatic alternatives. And I think to some degree we've seen some of that in this country. I mean, we lost almost 20% of manufacturing jobs in the United States in the decade before the financial crisis.
I'm from Flint. Tell me about it.
Exactly. And I think we don't know for a fact, obviously, but I think there's a pretty good chance that those losses at the pace of the losses, the sense of being displaced, has contributed to the polarization and the disaffection that we see today.
Glenn, you've done some work in this area now.
I have, and let me agree with Dan. I do think this is a huge problem, and our political class isn't that aware. But let's start with some good news, too. The artificial intelligence movement will enable people to be far better at many of their jobs. It complements the skills of many workers at the top and the bottom, hopefully not replacing economics professors in the middle of that. But we're not really prepared. You know, Dan mentioned Bill Gates. Bill Gates' idea was taxing robots. We don't need to build walls against the future. What we need to do is build bridges to it. And so we need to help people get ready. But our public policies are stuck in a labor market set of policies from the 1930s. They're not ready for today. And there I really agree with Dan.
So this is going to be a very dull conversation because we're all going to agree. But two perspectives on this. One is I'm struck, actually, in the last few years about how much more slowly this is happening than people were anticipating. The study you cited at the beginning of this segment had a kind of an earlier version, which I think came out in 2013, an Oxford study that caused a huge stir that I think said 47% of jobs were vulnerable to being automated within the next couple of decades. Cited thousands of times. And that really started the robots are about to take all of our jobs meme. If you actually look what's happened to labour markets in the last few years, we have unemployment at record lows across the rich world. We have employment at record highs in many places. And this is not all, gig jobs. It's not all terrible jobs. It's actually sustainable, real jobs. And so I think it's happening much more slowly. And I'm sort of comforted that, as Glenn said, in the end, history, every time we've had a technological innovation, has created jobs as well as destroying them. In fact, more of the creation than of the destruction. But where you're completely right is that the transition for particular people who don't have the right skills for the new kinds of jobs are traumatic. And we've definitely seen that over the last 20 years in manufacturing in the US and across the advanced world. And so for me, the question is, what do we do about it? And the lesson historically is that the US did it so much better 100 years ago in the last big industrial revolution, because you had a revolution in education at the same time. You had the creation of universal secondary education, in a sense provided people with the skills they needed when they came off the land to work in factories. And we haven't had that revolution in education and training now, and we need it.
Well, and Dan, it strikes me, employment's very, very high, unemployment's very, very low, but wages have not increased the way we would have thought given that employment situation. How much of that is being suppressed, actually, by technology?
Surely technology is playing a role. Surely globalization has played a role as well. I think where I probably disagree some with both Glenn and Zanny is more predictive than factual, but I'm skeptical about the capacity of public policy to manage a truly substantial displacement, even over a transitional period. I don't think we did a very good job at all with trade displacement. And trade displacement itself could be smallish compared to what happens in technology. Zanny makes an important point. The tendency towards alarmism, towards getting your tweet and all, I think is probably exaggerated. Certainly the point at which we'll have a kind of critical mass of job losses and maybe even the eventual magnitude of it. But when it's not just individuals, but whole groups of people, whether it's geographic communities or classes of people, I don't think that a system that's set up more or less for individual assistance is actually going to be particularly efficacious.
To me, at least, that raises two questions. What should we do about it, and how do you pay for it?
Well, what you should do about it, I mean, this issue where David and I started speaking about this issue was exactly around the campaign, with our saying, what's not being talked about. And Andrew Yang has talked about it some. The leading candidates have not. I suspect part of the reason is they don't have a great solution. To the degree that it intersects with trade, and it will intersect with trade, particularly with trade and services, I think that one political response is going to be further constraint on globalization. But I don't think, how do you deal with a progressive development of AI that is not closing down factories? That's unlikely to be the way it plays out. Instead, it will be within ongoing businesses, you'll have a displacement.
Well, I think that there are things that we could be doing. Austin Goolsbee and Penny Pritzker and I suggested a block grant for community colleges, which are the workhorses for these training programs. And something I used to be quite skeptical of, but I'm a little bit less so today, place-based aid, actually going into communities for income relief, for shoring up those communities' capacity to cope with change. If we don't do this, I worry, as Dan does, that we're going to wreck the social fabric that underlies change and the golden goose of our economic system.
Look, I think it is hard to overstate how dysfunctional the U.S. political environment is right now, and thus how unlikely the U.S. is to be a place where this is catalyzed. I agree with you in terms of one of the areas where we have where I also have changed my view is the whole question of left-behind areas and place-based aid. Because it used to be a view that you'd think, well, people would move to where the dynamic new jobs were. And I think we underestimated the kind of corrosive impact of a really large-scale hit to particular geographic areas. Interestingly, that's actually an area where the UK is now doing a huge, great experiment. Boris Johnson's levelling up agenda, which is the sort of big post-Brexit agenda for the UK, is very much about helping the region. So, as in 1979, maybe, Britain will forge some new social contract and we can, export it back to you. But the bit that I think is less likely, I don't think it's going to be, well, there's already protectionism in the US, but the area that worries me, where I think you will simply see a slowing of the technological change. So, for example, one of the examples people always use is truck drivers. Yes. Right now, you can't get enough truck drivers in this country, but it is an industry where those people who think robots will take our jobs say, well, within, a decade, there'll be no more jobs for truck drivers. If that were really to be the case, I think there would be huge political pressure simply to stop driverless trucks, and we would just be preventing progress that way.
But that's my question.
Really that is the center, though. I think that's the issue on that where the politics may be fought out in the not too distant future. That is there going to be an effort to intervene directly to at least slow down the source and pace of the change? Or is there going to be more or less complete reliance on adjustment mechanisms? And that's why I was making the point earlier that adjustment mechanisms, at least in the United States, have proven woefully inadequate to deal with trade issues.
Have we ever done it well? Have we ever done it well?
Not in a well-organized fashion, no. And what we've done is to put enormous pressure on the few sets of programs that exist. The best example, I think, is disability insurance. Disability insurance was not designed to deal with 55-year-old people who have lost a job and are not totally disabled. But that's the only thing that exists, which is why you have an entire industry of people who are on late-night TV saying they can get you a full disability claim.
Okay.
The irony, of course, is that the very technology which we're worried about displacing the jobs is what we need to harness in order to help retrain people.
But I agree with that, but there's a lot of intertemporal problems there. There's the skills mismatch, there's the geographic mismatch, which you mentioned, Zanny, and I think there may well also just be the job creation mismatch. That is, the jobs may be lost sooner and the new sets of jobs coming on a bit later.
Last thought,
The other irony is political. We're in a presidential campaign. Neither side is picking this up. The voters' anxiety would seem heavily correlated with President Trump's views and voters, yet we're probably not seeing as much as we should. On the left, the talk is Medicare for all, not helping people change.